everybody. It's great to be back here again. Tomorrow it's Friday, Parashat Toldot. This lesson I just heard now, there was a terrorist attack nearby in Samaria, near Ariel, not far from Itamar. And 5 people injured. They opened fire on a bus, so let's pray for their welfare. I mean, it's a crazy situation we are in. I mean, literally, there's every day something else happens. Let's get to our lesson. I want to focus. It's been a couple of weeks since I haven't had an opportunity to share with you little words of the portion. This week's portion called Toldot, I want to focus on Yitzchak, the father of Jacob and Esav, of Yaakov and Esav, where in reality, if we want to understand, a lot of times the special character of our forefathers, and we have to go back from the beginning of when they first mentioned and see how certain words that relate to them are mentioned in the Torah. And this gives us a deeper understanding, of course. It's just the Torah is an endless reservoir of light, divine light, and we're always trying to shed more of that light and understand more. And I've mentioned before that anytime a word is repeated over and over again in the Torah, we know it's a special sign that something teaching us. And I want to go back to the birth of Isaac, because that's going to be our focus of this week's portion. We could talk also about Jacob and Esav, but we can wait for another time. And let's really focus on Isaac today. And when we talk about his birth, we see the word that's repeated over and over again is the root Gimel Mem Lamed, in Hebrew meaning camel. Or it also means to bestow, right? To give to somebody. It could also mean to wean. And we'll bring down first in the portion in Genesis 21 and Parashat Vayera, we see when it says Vayigdal HaYeled, when Isaac grew up and he was already older, Vayigamal, and then he was literally weaned. Vayasav Mishteh Gadol B'yom Higamel et Yitzchak. And then it says Abraham made a very big party, Avraham Avinu, his father, when he was weaned. Okay, so the party that it's referring to is a weaning party after 2 years. It's interesting. Rabbeinu Bachia, one of the commentaries, bring down, why did they make the party after 2 years? We know that they have the Brit Milah on the 8th day. There are certain opinions, by the way, that it says the word Higamel, Hey is 5, Gimel is 3. So that's 8. And then Mal means to circumcise. So hinting that this party was, of course, was also done on the day of circumcision. But here the Torah is stressing when he was weaned that they made a party. And Rabbeinu Bachia says that this is, when a child now is getting older, and he's 2 years old, and Abraham discovered, God at a very young age, at the age of 3, he began to see that there's one creator of the universe. So this was a very special age for beginning his 3rd year. At 2 years of being weaned now, Yitzchak Avinu, Isaac, so it was very, very, very special for the father. And therefore he made a special party relating to his son at that age. But so the word that we're going to see now, and it's fascinating, is the word, again, the root, Gimel Mem Lamed, Gamal, camel, or weaning, and all this is related to Isaac. And the question is why? Now, first I want to show you some other parts of it. If we look in Genesis 24, our last week's portion, Chayei Sarah, before we get to this week's portion, because we're going to see another word is brought down in this week's portion in relation to Isaac. So we see it says in verse number 10, right? It says, Vayikach ha'eved 10 gemalim migmalei adonav. So the servant Eliezer, he takes 10 camels from Abraham. Vayelach v'chol tuv adonav biyado. He put all the goods there in his hand, and he goes to Aram Naharayim, to the city of Nachor, right? So he's taking everything on camels, and then it says in Genesis, the same chapter, in verse number 11, Vayavrecha gmalim bechutz la'ir, and he parks the camels outside the city, El Be'er HaMayim, by the spring, by the water well. So it's fascinating, when the Shovot, when those who come to draw from the well come out. So it's fascinating again, we see another mention of the word. It's a constant repetition of that root word, Gmalim, camels, that word. If we look in, and by the way, the portion, Chayei Sarah, which is the major portion regarding Isaac, so it's mentioned countless times, the word, that root word Gamal, meaning camel, as we said before. And if we look again in verse number 19, Utechal Ashkoto, when she finished giving water to Eliezer, the maidservant, the servant of Abraham, So she says, I'm going to give now to your camels, just like he made the sign, right? That's going to be a sign that she's going to be the wife of Isaac. And if we look in again verse number 20, she runs over to the water, to the shoket, the place where the water fills up from the well, and she runs over to draw, and vatishav lechol gamalav, and she drew the water for all his camels. Constantly repetition of the word camel. Look at verse number 22, the same thing. When the camels finish drinking, etc., etc. So it's a constant mention, and of course the Torah could have spoken in a lot, more shorthand, and not have to mention constantly that same repeating the word over and over again. And this is also repeated later on, if we see in this chapter 24, verse number 32, again. He goes to the house, he opens up the camels, it says again, etc., etc. And it's more times. I'm not repeating, don't forget that the story is repeated twice, so the camels repeated twice, and all that. But I want to mention, if we look in chapter 24, verse number 63, all the way through, we see a very powerful mention of that same word where it says, Vatisarifkat eineh, she lifts up her eyes, Vateri et Yitzchak, and she sees Isaac, Vatipol mi'al gamal, and she falls off the camel. So right there again, she falls off Hagamal. That same letters could mean Higamel if we spell it different, if we sound it differently, meaning also to wean. Right here it means she fell off the camel. So what's going on over here? Why is the word camel mentioned? I'll mention another time because it's very interesting. It's even mentioned in an acronym. If we look in chapter 24, verse number 25, it says, Vatomer elav gam teven gam mispo. She says to him, I have straw and I have animal feed, ravi manu we have, gam makom lalun. We even have a place to stay. Now in Hebrew, gam makom lalun, if you take the first letter of each of those words, gam is gimel, makom place, lamed lalun. It spells the first letter of each of those words, gamal again. It's fascinating. So it's not only mentioned directly, it's also hinted in acronyms. Okay, so we know, what is the word that, again, I spoke before a little bit, the word gamal, there meant to wean, it also means camel, it also means to bestow, right? As we read in Psalms number 13, verse number 6, it says, Vani b'chastecha batachti, I've relied on your love and kindness, Yagel libi b'shotecha, my heart is happy, it rejoices in your salvation. Ashir al Hashem, I will sing to God, He gamal alai, because He bestowed upon me. So the same root, gamal, means also to bestow. So it has all those meanings. Now, bring another example. If we look in Numbers, it says Vahi memochorat. And here we're talking about the story where Aaron was being tested, because when Korach and Adato, they rebelled against Moshe Rabbeinu and against the priesthood. So it says in chapter number 17 of Numbers, verse number 23, it says, Vahi memocharat, was the next day, Vayavo Moshe, and Moshe Rabbeinu came to the oil, to the tabernacle, oil idud, v'nei parach mata Aaron, and the staff of Aaron began to flower, lebeit Levi, to the house of the Levites, and it says, Vayotzei perach, and a flower comes out, Vayatzei tzitz. In other words, the flowers came out, and the tzitz, which referred to the budding of the flowers turning into fruit, Vayigmol shkedim, and the fruit were now completed, and they were shkedim, they were almonds. So the word Vayigmol here refers to the ripening of the fruit. The fruit were ripened fruit. So Vayigmol is like weaning, it can mean ripen. So those were a couple of examples we saw from the portion of Chayei Sarah and the beginning of Isaac, and Chayei Sarah, the word Gamal. Okay? And what is the meaning of this? And I want to discuss that in a moment. But before we get there, I want to quickly mention our portion. This week's portion, Toldot. What is the key word that repeats itself very, very often regarding Isaac, right? So the key word is very interesting because it's connected to the camel in a way. It's similar, dealing with water. And you probably guessed it when I mentioned that. If we look in our portion, chapter 26, if we read it, it says, Vayigdal Aish. We start with the first verse in chapter 13. It says Isaac grew up, haloch v'gadel. He began to get very, very big. Vayhilo miknetzon. In other words, wealthy. He had he had herds of sheep and all that, and in other words, he began to raise jealousy amongst the Plishtim, the Philistines, because of what he had. And then it says, "V'chol ha'be'erot asher chafu avdei aviv," and all the be'erot are the wells that the servants of his father Abraham, they had dug in the time of his father, sitmum Plishtim, so the Philistines would cover them over with afal, with earth. So, Vayomer Avimelech, so what happens? As we all know, is that Isaac uncovers all these wells, right? And of course, there's a whole thing going on over here with Avimelech and etc. But so Isaac moves away, and it says, "Vayashav Yitzchak bayichberu et habe'erot." So Isaac goes back in verse number 18, and he says he begins to re-dig all the wells that were dug in the time of his father, and he starts giving them names. He's giving them names. The same names, as a matter of fact. It says, "Vayikra lahem shemot kishmot asher kara lahem aviv." He actually names these different wells the same names that his father named them, and they were fighting over the herdsmen of Gerar were fighting with the herdsmen of Isaac, etc. Until finally they dug a well called Rechovot. But we see over and over again, he keeps talking about the names of different wells, and the word Be'er is repeated over and over again. And then finally it ends with Be'er Sheva. He comes to Be'er Sheva, the well of seven, when they had that, they made a covenant over there. The famous story, right? So, the covenant that was made of Be'er Sheva with Abraham, that is of course a deep number. Why is it called Sheva? Why seven? But Be'er again is mentioned over there. And at that moment, God appears. It says God appears to Isaac, etc. And then he tells him he will bless him, etc. So then he builds an altar there. So we see the word here, and it's a certain section dealing with Isaac, particularly because before and after it's dealing really with Jacob and Esau. But here, when it's talking about Isaac, it's mentioning the Be'er and his action that he's doing around that wells, the constant action around the Be'erot. Okay, so the question that I'm trying to ask is, these two words are coming up regarding Isaac. In the beginning, when Eliezer comes out to search a wife for Isaac, right? The first place he goes to is also Be'er, connecting the camels with the Be'er, with the wells. So again, I think I proven it, mentioned over and over there. You can go see it for yourself. I'm not going to mention all those verses because it's one verse after the other in chapter 26, mentioning the wells. But the question, of course, is why? What is the deep meaning behind that? So going back, let's first discuss, I have to mention a very quick concept. We know that our forefathers, each of them represent, we know in our deep esoteric teachings, they represent spheres. Abraham represents chesed, love and kindness. And we see by the actions of Abraham, he's at the tent, he's running around, he's looking for poor people to bring inside his tent. He's helping bring back those idol worships that were, Rashi brings down that they were bowing down to the dust of their feet, and Abraham told them, wash your feet off. He'd wash their idol worship dust off their feet and try to bring them under the wings of heaven. So Abraham was extremely active in his activities in every way, fighting the wars, rescuing his nephew Lot. And everything about Abraham we know is chesed. Chesed is love and kindness, means to give over for yourself, to be a vessel of giving to others, to give to other people, to bestow upon others. Now, if we think about it, in the word in Hebrew of camel, what does camel mean really? Camel means ligmol, to give over. As we said, if we take the root of the word camel, it's also represented actually by the camel itself, that when it drinks, it has a lot of water storage within it. And therefore it can now draw into that water it is taken in and survive long distances within the desert. So the camel represents that storage of something coming from the outside, the water source, filling the storage supply for drinking for a camel, so which is really interesting. And the same thing when a plant ripens, it's called, we mentioned before in Numbers, when the staff of Aaron ripened and the almonds came out, it says Vayigmol shkedim. Why? Because what causes the ripening of fruit? When it has all its liquid, it has all its nourishment. So now it is ripened, right? So it no longer needs all that because now it has reached its maturity. The same thing when a child is nursed, meaning the same root, gamal, a child is nursed, it doesn't need anymore the milk of its mother because now it can be on its own. So it's received that blessing of milk that was bestowed upon it. So meaning the word gamal is to bestow, to give. So all these words, as a matter of fact, they seem more of words relating to Abraham than Isaac, right? Because Abraham's the one who represents chesed in all the actions he does and to give over for himself and all that. When we look at Isaac, his personality is different. Isaac, for example, he doesn't have to go out to find a wife for himself. The work is done for him. The servant of Abraham goes out and he's standing at the well and bringing back a wife for him. In addition, he's the one who was binded on the altar, right, to be slaughtered. He gave himself over totally, he was totally very, very passive. That's the word. He's passive, allowed himself to totally give in to the being slaughtered. Of course, at the end he was stopped. The angel stopped Abraham, but whatever it was, his personality is very passive. The opposite seemed to be the activity of Abraham. That's another example. The same thing with the blessings that were given over to Jacob later, as we all know. The one who was very active in having the blessings, being stopped going to Esau, the evil child, was Rivka, his wife. Right? She was the one who was active in that whole thing, and Isaac wasn't aware what was going on, like it was sort of under his radar. After he knew about it, of course, he blessed on it, but it happened that regarding him, he was the passive one there. Although he gave the blessing, but it was Rivka that did all that work to make it happen. She was the one who also told him, about, I don't want, marrying the women of the Canaanite women, you have to go abroad. So Rivka pushed Isaac into sending Jacob abroad again. We see the passivity, which is known, that Isaac represents the midah of gvura. Gvura means restraint, right? It means power, might, and also restraint. So it's Isaac. A little dusty. But restraint, right? I couldn't restrain myself with the sneezing. But anyway, that's exactly the lesson of sneezing, right? We trying to strain ourselves. We can't. But Isaac Isaac represents restraint, represents passivity. All those midot refer to Isaac. So the question is, how does that connect to the Gamal? On the other hand, if we look at the other word that we spoke about the wells regarding Isaac. The well, what is a well basically? You have to realize in Israel, we have an issue with water here. It's not like a place of the world that water is very easy to go to find and all that. It's raining all the time, but here, no. So in Israel, there are three types of water that we can draw into, especially going back to the ancient times of Tanakh. And one of them is called a bowl. A bowl is a pit that was dug, and having different channels go into the pit and fill it from the rainwater coming from the outside. So the bowl is more like the camel, like it gets its water from the outer source. Interesting. But what's mentioned with Isaac is not the bowl, the pit. It's mentioned the be'er, the other water source. The other water source refers to water that comes from within. It's called a be'er, that you have to actually dig down and get to where the water is located, to the level, the water table under the ground. So the water is there. All you have to do is dig. Your job now is not to wait for it to rain, but to get to the water source and allow the water to fill up your well. So that is a different type of digging. It's like drilling for water, right? It's a different kind of water source. The third water source is a spring, where you don't have to work hard. The spring water is just constantly all year round coming out of the ground. That's another water source, right? Which is it's a rarer source. In Israel there are a lot of springs, but obviously the Shomron, here in Samaria, we have a lot of the sources as well. So it's interesting, there are three types. It depends what part of the geography of Israel. When Isaac was in the southern part, it rains a lot less in the south. You can't rely on water so much coming from the outside, right? Although they've dug pits as well. But there's a lot of water. In those areas, they would actually dig and get to the water sources of the buildup, over the water table, getting down there and getting to the source itself by drilling literally for water, making wells. And that was really what Isaac was all about. Now, so if we look at those two sides, how do we connect the camel with the wells and all that? And I'd like to hear to mention it, we'll bring down a Talmudic source. The Talmud says, which is very interesting, the Talmud brings down, and it says, if someone sees a camel in a dream, and it's brought in the tractate of Brachot, it's also brought down other sources in the Zohar Kadosh. It says, Mitan niknesa lo min hashamayim. If someone sees a camel in a dream, it means that this person it was decreed upon him that death, that death was on the way, God forbid. But he was saved from that death. In other words, he was supposed to die in some kind of accident, some kind of whatever it was, and God had mercy upon him. So if someone sees a camel in a dream, it means that something bad should have happened to him, but he was saved from it. Okay? Now, what does that mean? That basically means is that the camel, that represents, we said before, it represents chesed, right? Love and kindness. But if someone sees that in a dream, it says death was decreed upon him and he was saved from the death. What does that all mean? And here, in order to clarify this, I'll remind you when Rivka first meets Isaac, when the Eliezer is coming with her from Mesopotamia, and they're coming now to meet Isaac in the southern part of Israel. What the first thing that she does, she jumps off the camel, right? She falls off the camel. In other words, not like she fell, but she jumped off the camel. And the Zohar Kadosh, our master of the Kabbalistic esoteric teachings, explains that the camel represents some kind of husk, the husk of dinim, judgment, which he calls it, there's a certain name for it, called, okay, we have to restrain us. So there's a certain husk that is represented within the camel. And when she falls off the camel, she was sort of symbolizing that she is going to separate herself from the husk. And that husk was the same thing about the dream. And the Zohar brings it down. When someone dreams about a camel, he was saved from that particular husk. What is this husk? The angel of death. What's going on? Why is the angel of death connected here to the words we spoke about before, meaning to wean, meaning to bestow, love and kindness and all that? How does that connect to it? We'll get back to that in a moment. And before I do answer that question, I want to bring another example. Another example is that to show you that camel represents judgment. If we look in the Numbers, in the portion of the spies, when it mentions the different spies, it says, Lematei Dan Amiel ben Gmali. The tribe of Dan, right? The name of the spy that was sent from the tribe of Dan was Amiel. Ben, he was the son of Gmali, of the camel. Interesting. He was called Ben Gmali. In other words, that he failed in his mission, right? And his name is Dan, to judge. And he was one of the spies that didn't give a good report. And it says that he's Dan. Dan means to judge. We know that in one hand, we said to love and kindness and to give and all that. That's what's behind the Gamal, the camel, because it has all this water received. And to bestow and all that. But here we see the opposite. We see that it refers to Dan. Dan means to judge, judgment, not to love and kindness. So it's interesting, it sort of contradicts in a way. What's going on over here? Hope I'm not confusing you all. And but I'm going to wrap this up and try to explain some of these concepts. And the answer is this. Finally, we're getting some to try to wrap it up and answer a little bit over here. Is that the concept of giving is what life is all about. We know in this world, it says in the tractate of Shabbat, and I'd like to read that source as well, there's a beautiful Talmudic passage that talks about the letters mentioned in Shabbat in page 104. And there it says, right, Atu Daldeke, children came to the Beit Midrash. It's brought down in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. And children came to the study house, the Beit Midrash. ואמרו מילי דאפילו בימי יהושע בן נון לא איתמר כבתיו. They said things that even in the days of Joshua, these kind of things were not said. And what were these things? Explaining the alphabet in Hebrew. So we follow the alphabet, Aleph Bet, Aleph Bina. In other words, to teach understanding. Aleph in Hebrew means to teach. So to teach understanding. Gimel Dalet, what is Gimel Dalet? That's the next letter. Gimel Gemol Dalim. Gimel, which is Gamal, the camel, right? It means to bestow. Dalim, the letter Dalet is from Dalim, the poor. So the letter Gimel represents to give, to the letter Dalet, to the fourth letter, which means to give to the poor. And then he says, Ma'itama pshuta kari the Gimel gabe Dalet. Why is the leg of the Gimel extended out towards the Dalet? Shekein dago shel gomel chasadim lo rutz achal dalim. Because those who want to give love and kindness have to run after the poor, right? And the Gemara says, Ma'itama pshuta kari the Dalet legabe Gimel. So why is if you look at the Dalet, it's bent a little bit towards the Gimel, the letter Gimel. Now, to understand this, you have to know how the letters look in Hebrew. But the actual, the Talmud here is talking about the actual shape of the letters. So the Dalet is sort of bent towards the Gimel. And therefore, the Talmud answers, the limtze leil nafshesh. So he can actually provide, to allow himself to be caught eventually, right? The person who's giving the love and kindness is running after the Dalet, the poor person. But you have to let yourself be caught. But why is his face of the Dalet turned the other way, not facing the Gimel? Right? So when you're giving him, he's giving in a way that he's doing it privately, not in front of everybody, between him and the person. You shouldn't be embarrassed when you want to give something to somebody. You don't want the whole world to see you giving him money, but you do it between you and him, right? So anyway, here we see in the Talmud of Shabbat, we see that again the love and kindness coming up in reference to the Gimel, which gives over to the Dalet. Okay? Now, this just strengthens the question I said before. How does this represent Isaac? And not only that, why is it the Zohar Kadosh saying that she has to get off the donkey, the camel, she's getting off of this klipa called Lamed. I'm not going to mention the name, you don't say the name of these angels, but there's an angel called, it starts with Lamed, ends with Tav in Hebrew. And that refers to this husk that has to be sweetened, because they cause destruction and damage and death. And why would that be the case if we see everything about the Gimel, the Gamal is to give and to bestow love and kindness? How can we wrap this all up and tie it all together and try to understand what's going on over here? And now finally I'll try to do some of that. And the answer is this. First of all, we know that Abraham, he was the one to give love and kindness. And Isaac we spoke about that before, that his whole midah, his whole character was more of judgment. Because again, judgment means to restrain, to make boundaries, right? Which is very interesting. So he's more of when someone makes boundaries and restrains himself, so they're more of a vessel. A vessel is sort of the receiver more, right? That they're making those boundaries. The giver gives sometimes without boundaries, right? So they don't have those same boundaries. So here, Gamal, we said, represents that love and kindness has within it, the source where it received to give over, right? The camel has the water in it to give over. Or when a child is weaned, it receives the mother's milk and is now weaned. So it reaches the level of being weaned from that source, okay? So Isaac really represents the receiving end, you can say, on one side. On one side, he receives, when he's weaned, he's receiving the mother's milk. When he receives the blessing, of Abraham, right, from his father and all that, he continues that whole thing. He's bound on the altar, right? He's sort of on the receiving end. He's the one that's being on the receiving end. So that represents Gvura, the other hand of Gvura. But there are two types of giving, and here it's very important to stress. There's giving that is a blessing, and then there's giving that could be giving in the wrong way. Love and kindness has to have the proper boundaries to it. And when it's only coming from one end, so it's problematic. A lot of times there's a relationship where one person is always the giver and one person is always the taker. It has to really be a double thing. Giving, not only a giving and taking relationship, but a giving on both sides of a relationship. When there's only one side giving, that could be problematic. You need the proper balance of that whole thing. So the camel, when she's coming off the camel, saying, "Wait a second, there's another." Now it's really the birth of Isaac is all about being weaned of that, being receiving, right? Because when you are constantly receiving, you have to make the boundaries. Really, Isaac in reality is making the boundaries of that receiving. It's not like he's a taker, God forbid. Isaac is creating boundaries of that. He's received what he needed in order to do his mission, but now he is making boundaries to that. So the formation of the boundaries are represented by getting off of the camel. Because when a person takes without any kind of taking for the sake of taking and not of how to bestow on others what you've received, and to continue to do love and kindness, to continue to do good, but just to be, as it's someone's saying, someone's a hog, just keeps taking for himself. That kind of taking is what the Zohar Kadosh is hinting when someone sees in a dream, and he's been saved from this. In other words, he's not going to be a receiver for the sake of receiving, but receiving something for a doer to be a doer. That's going to bring him the blessing. But when the wrong kind of receiving is on that end, then that is the shell, the husk of the camel. That becomes the husk. So there's a certain kind of receiving that is positive when you want to give. But if you're receiving for the benefit of just yourself and in a selfish way, that becomes the husk that you have to get off of. And that, how do we know all about this kind of thing? How do we know when it's, when you can receive and say, okay, now I want to become a giver? That Isaac actually teaches us that lesson. When Isaac received, this love and kindness and received from Abraham, who represents Chesed, he becomes now making the boundaries. He's the boundary maker. And therefore, when you're making the proper boundaries and you're receiving in order to give later, that is the blessing of that's Gvura. That is showing restraint and knowing how much I can receive in order to give later. And I can't receive more than that, otherwise it's going to explode and all that. That is a very important lesson where Isaac comes to play. Now, the Be'er, right? So this connects right to the wells of Isaac. What is the whole issue of the wells of Isaac now? The fact that he was weaned and he received, from the love and kindness. Now we see that his active role, on one hand, is to dig those wells, and that is activity, of course, digging out wells that were covered over. But he's revealing, he's not taking water that's coming from the outside. He is now taking water that he's received, that he grew up, he was educated, he was weaned, and he's using the energy that he received to do positive actions, to continue that giving and bestowing side, but through Gvura, through the measurement of restraint. And therefore, it was all covered up. He didn't have to wait for water to come from the outside. The water was there with him, but he had to get to it. He had to dig in his inner essence and find out, wait a second, I don't have to go look far, I don't have to look away somewhere else. It's right here with me. It's right here with me. And he just has to dig deep enough to find it. That lesson of digging deep enough to find it is what what Isaac's all about. And that's the revelation, of when he reveals the inner water wells, which of course refers to the spirituality. And we see that he calls the names of the wells the same names that his father called them. Why? And the answer is because he knows where he got it from. It's not like he's saying, oh, this is all me. No. In the blessing of being bestowed, the love and kindness from his father, from the tradition, from that beautiful divine light that extends from Avraham Avinu. He now is on one hand revealing his own independence and discovering what he has within him, but he remembering where he came from and where he drank from, what filled his well in the first place. And that's a perfect combination of these two midot of love and kindness on one side, and the other side, the be'er, the well, to find and discover your well. So we see here again, now this very, very deep concept we spoke about is all about what Yitzchak is all about in his inner essence. Later on, his son, Yaakov, was born in this week's portion. But we see how he will develop into be the perfect unification of the two forces of love and kindness and restraint, which is called Midat HaTiferet, which is the middle road, right, of both of those combinations. That's the perfect combination of the two, where Yaakov is born. So, to summarize this long discourse of understanding the different measurements, we call them the character, the midot, the sfirot, we see that the Torah stresses the camel to understand that there is a giving here that comes from chesed, love, and kindness in regards to Isaac. But you have to take that, and you have to make those boundaries with that. You can't just be drinking like a camel, drinking and drinking and drinking, and turning it into like a nightmare when you're not remembering, that, wait a second, I have to become a giver myself. So you have to create boundaries to that giving, and that boundaries is what Isaac does, and he becomes the well. He unravels the wells that will cover it over, realizing that now that I've drank so much and I have all this in me, I have to reveal it and begin to go forward and give to others. That is the deep, very deep meaning behind the different things we saw today regarding Isaac. One side of the words Gamal and the words well, and it's very interesting. If we take the Gimel of Gamal, which is G, and the Bet of Be'er, well, it says Gimel Bet. What is Gimel Bet? Gimel Bet means it's the number of 5 in Gematria. That's 5 is 5 fingers to give, right, on one hand. That's one side. But more than that, it's interesting in English, the word give is to be a giver, right? So Gimel Bet, give, there's something deep here in all languages. And we see, where's the word give come from? Give means to combine the Gimel from the camel and the Bet for Be'el, the well, to be a giver. And that comes from, of course, receiving at a certain stage in your life, and then later in your life you become a giver. So, if we have to wrap it up and summarize totally, let us be blessed. We understand that our lives, we have to appreciate where our source came from and what we were given as young adults and adults and who helped us. And we have to try to utilize our inner strength and energy, to, once we've made boundaries for all that, we can now go forward and to give over to others from ourselves, to make this world a much better world to live in. We wouldn't have such tragedies every moment if all these, this terrible, terrorist attacks, that this evil people in the world that come and do terrible things, and we'd have a much better world to live in. Let us all focus on being givers and doing good for society. Shabbat Shalom, Besorot Tovot, Yeshuot v'Nechamot.